Awesome. All right, welcome everybody to our Wiser, Be Wiser at virtual interviewing event. We're so glad to have you guys here, and we really appreciate you guys joining us and contributing with your time. My name is Jessica Liu. I'm a PGY4 resident, and I'm the director of the Wiser podcast. Just a little bit of background. WISER stands for Women in Surgery at Emory Residencies. It's a podcast that was started in 2018 by Emory students and residents to highlight the achievements, life stories, and careers of women surgeons. But now the E doesn't stand just for Emory. E is for everywhere now, as we now have episodes that feature people from other institutions as well as people in different fields of medicine as well. So we've just launched our third season that kicked off this last week, and you can find our episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or on our website, wiserpodcast.com. So we have a wonderful panel of chief residents in ENT and general surgery that have recently interviewed virtually for fellowship. And so this is a really great opportunity for us to learn from their experiences and pick their brains. We also have our Emory program director for the general surgery program, Dr. Srinivasan, on the line to lend her hand and expertise. And so I first wanted to give Dora Danko an opportunity to introduce herself. She is our WISER student president. So Dora, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, my name is Dora. I'm at M4 currently at Emory. I'm interested in applying into plastics, not this year, but the next year for research. Thank you all for coming to this. I want to thank again the panel that we've assembled for taking time out of their busy schedules for doing this. So I hope you guys learned something.
Awesome. Next, I'm just going to introduce Dr. Srinivasan, or Dr. Srinivasan, do you want to just step in and say a few words and say hey to everybody?
Welcome. I understand that we have people from all over. The residents are the most valuable resource here. I'm actually going to anxiously be listening to what they have to say as we construct virtual interviews for this year. But at the end of the session, please feel free to reach out to me. The team here has done a really tremendous job with WISER. I would really encourage anyone who hasn't checked out the site to check it out. They're in their third season now. They're doing a lot of great stuff. I'm very, very proud of the work that they've all done. So that's it.
Great. All right, so let's get started by introducing our panelists. For our panelists, if you could introduce yourself, what specialty you're going into, how many interviews you actually did for your field, and then what your interview setup generally was, how you had your, where did you do it? How, did you have lighting, a halo light, or did you do anything special for any of that? So let's start with Matt and Allie.
You want me to start? All right. Hey guys, I'm Allie. I'm one of the PGY 5 residents here at Emory. I am just matched into surgical oncology, so I'll be starting my fellowship at Ohio State next year, which I'm pretty excited about.
The Ohio State.
Yeah, say it right. The.
You're right.
OH.
Is that it? Is that everything I'm supposed to say?
No. Can you please talk about how many interviews you did and what your setup was? How many virtual interviews you did?
I think I ended up doing about 14 in total. I think a couple of them I actually did right here. This is Matt's office, so I try to stay out of it and give him his space. But I think there was one time that for whatever reason I couldn't be in the other room, but I sat in. What I wanted to, and what the feedback I'd gotten, is that you kind of want a fairly blank or not terribly interesting background. So that's what I had, with good overhead, like indoor lighting, not near a window, or if it was, the blinds were closed so that it wasn't too bright and you could see my face and it wasn't like washed out. But that was pretty much what I did. Or here, and we just made sure that that bathroom door was closed.
And for those people that may not know, Matt and Allie are married, and they're both chief residents that we're doing this together. So we will definitely touch on that later in this panel.
I'm Matt, also PGY5 chief resident general surgery at Emory. I matched into cardiothoracic. I will be the thoracic tract cardiothoracic fellow at Emory starting next year. I can't remember how many interviews I actually did. I know that I went physically on 5 of them before everything got shifted to digital. I did the remainder of my interviews. Some of them I did in an office of one of our faculty at Grady, on the Grady campus, and then some of them I did just right here in in our apartment. But it was, I don't know if there was one that was better than the other. Just a place with good Wi-Fi is all you need.
Cool. Awesome. Let's jump next to Clara Farley.
Hello, everybody. I'm Clara Farley. I'm a PGY5 chief resident here at Emory. I am going into breast surgical oncology, and I have still not matched almost a year later. Officially will match on October 15th, though. So what?
Is tonight's your list?
Oh yeah, rank list was due today, but I mean, it's been submitted for like 3 months now. So, but anyway, so I did my first 3 interviews were in person, and then I transitioned over to virtual. So I did, I think, 8 virtual, and similar to what they were saying, I did all of them for the most part in either my home office or the basement. And basically I picked the place by the end of it that was the closest I could get to the Wi-Fi without a crazy background, because that played into a lot of issues that I had early on, that my home Wi-Fi was just not as good as I had thought it was. And so that played into sort of where I ultimately ended up setting up shop. And I tried to have, the good lighting, plain background, but by the end of it, really all I cared about was that my connection was as good as it could be, because that can really make or break your interview experience. And if you have, any technical glitches throughout it, you only get, some programs you're bouncing from room to room, only 7-minute interviews. And so if you have an issue, that can really not only, abruptly stop your conversation, but it can cut a lot of your time with those people short. So that would be definitely a tip, that make sure you find the best spot and wherever you're going to be interviewing, whether it's your home or somewhere else.
Awesome. Let's break up the general surgery train a little and go to Danny Scarola.
Hey all. My name is Danny. I'm a 5th year ENT resident here. I matched into microvascular reconstruction for next year, so I'll be doing free flaps over at Case Western Reserve University up in Cleveland. Excited about that. I ended up doing probably about 13 interviews, all virtual, because my interviews were sort of later in the game. And everybody sort of did it differently, but like Clara said, a lot of people have you bouncing from room to room. So I think the Wi-Fi is absolutely critical. Someplace the Wi-Fi, you're comfortable with the setup, the place, everything. So I feel like the common theme here is we all kind of do it at home or somewhere. I ran home for every interview just because I wanted to be in the same place without any interruptions or any surprises. This is actually the room I did it in. It's my conference room in my building, and I reserve it so nobody can walk in here. I have like a plain background here. The only thing I wish I had that I noticed some people, it made a huge difference, is if you have like a light that you can put on top of your computer and actually light up your face so people can actually see you. I tried to use like window natural light, but it doesn't really quite work in here. And the other thing I'll say is, an attending actually gave me the tip to stack your computer on some books. So like my computer right now is actually on like 4 books so that it's looking at me head on. And so if you notice a difference, if I do this and point the computer up at me, it's like a whole different perspective than if like you're just looking at somebody, they kind of fill the screen, their head on. I think it looks a little bit cleaner, easier to watch. So yeah, I think that agree with all the points that everybody mentioned already, and just add that kind of like them being able to see you, looking at other people's screens during interviews. There was like a pretty wide range and distinct difference. Like some people were too dark to see, some people were like back here, up here, and I think the people that you could see and that were just like the main focus of the screen stood out. Because what other way do you have to stand out during these interviews other than like looking good on a computer screen? So I think that was kind of the things that I noticed most.
Awesome. And last but not least, Caitlin Fitzgerald, our wonderful administrative chief.
Hey guys, I'm Caitlin Fitzgerald, also one of the chief residents in general surgery. I am going to trauma and critical care, and similar to Clara, I matched on October 14th, so I still don't know where I'm going next year. Unfortunately, I was unable to do any in-person interviews. Similar to Danielle, all of mine were later in the year, so I did 17 virtual interviews and no in-person. And just to echo kind of what everyone else said, my first interview I actually tried to do for my office at main campus, but realized quickly that you can actually hear all of the codes that go on the hospital pager on your Zoom. So I would just say, make sure that wherever you do it is in a really quiet place. So whether that's home or another office that you may have. I also tried doing one with my husband at home while he was working, and also figured out that you could hear him in the basement while I was on the top floor. So again, just kind of like test things out and figure out where the most quiet place is. Similar to everyone else, I sat in my kitchen with a pretty blank, like gray wall behind me. A couple days before my first one that I was going to do at home, I actually just sat in the kitchen and played with all different kind of angles of the computer screen, lighting, just to figure out what worked best. And I actually, again, had my husband on a Zoom with me so we could kind of figure out what looked good. So just kind of practice with someone in terms of lighting and go from there.
Awesome. So that is our panel for now. We actually have a couple more chiefs that may join us, but right now they're tied up in the operating room. So just as kind of how this is going to run, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to either type them in the chat box or raise your hand, and Dora will let us know if that happened, but use the little participant thing to raise your hand if you want, or type in a question. And then we have some questions ready to go, so we'll get started with those. Not everyone's necessarily going to answer every question, but if any of you guys want to talk, feel free to obviously speak up and chip in. So let's start with the first question that we have on here. I mentioned, or I heard you guys mentioning a lot, that you were switching a lot between, different interviewers, and it was, quick, and you were maybe burning up some time with your Wi-Fi and stuff like that. Did you feel like, how long were your interviews usually generally? I think, Claire, you had mentioned something like 7 minutes. And do you feel like that was enough time for you to actually have meaningful conversations with people in this format?
Yeah, I can take this. So, yeah, I'd say that they ranged anywhere from 7 to, I think the longest interview that I had was like 18 minutes or something like that. And honestly, even in the 7-minute ones, if the interviewer has actually read your application and gone through your CV and your letters of rec, then I think you can have a meaningful interview in 7 minutes. That it's really dependent on them in that short amount of time, because if they're just asking you open-ended questions and they really don't know much about you, then no, you're not going to get much out of it. But if they have actually taken the time to read your materials and they can ask pointed questions in that 7-minute period, then yes, it actually is pretty meaningful. The longer the interview, I mean, it's kind of interesting how it'll fly by. Whether it's 7 minutes or 18 minutes, it does tend to fly by. And you kind of get asked the same questions over and over in each room, but a lot of programs will try to have, similar to what they would do for their in-person interviews, they try to have a room for a topic. So like in one room, they'll ask you about your research experience. In one room, they'll ask you about your clinical experience. In one room, they'll ask you about social wellness, things like that. And so for the most part, that was kind of how it was for my interview experience as well. The bouncing around definitely does throw you for a loop at first, and you get nervous that you're not going to be in the right room, or you'll miss the link for that room and all of that. What I would recommend, and what I started to do, is just before every interview, I had a sheet of paper or a Word document or something put together of like, at this time you'll be in this room, at this time you'll be with this person, here are the Zoom links. And then I just had written down, like, if you have a problem, this is the email or this is the phone number to call, because they'll give you all that information, but it gets lost in a bunch of emails. So just try to stay organized the night before, the morning of, so that if my connection fails, if I get kicked out of this room early, or if nobody's joining my room, this is who I can call quickly and get some help.
That is so helpful to know. Thanks, Clara. Does anybody else want to pitch in on that question?
Claire, I second the sheet of paper in front of you. Like, I wanted a hard copy right in front of me with my exact schedule, who to call, what to do in case my computer glitched out, and that like really made me more comfortable with where I was supposed to be and when. My interviews were like 10 to 30-ish minutes. Sometimes there were like 2 or 3 people in one room. That was the longer interviews, but they flew by. And some of them, they would have it cut off at a certain time. And so you'd be like mid-sentence, like it would give you like a 5-minute warning and then a 1-minute warning or something like that. And then it would just cut off, and it was kind of awkward because you're like mid-sentence, or they're mid-sentence, or they're like giving you their email address. that's the other thing. If you don't have people's email addresses from emails and other things communicated with you, like ask for it if you want to talk to them or like continue a conversation. And then other times they were like, your interview ends at this time and your next one starts at this time, and you don't want to be late for the next one, but they're still talking. So you kind of have to like politely be like, and yeah, I don't want to make you run over into your next interview, but thanks so much. Moving on, you know, and then you have to switch to your next one. So I've had it like various ways. And I've also had like 10 different interviews with the same program on 10 different days. And that was absolutely horrendous. Dr. Srinivasan, please don't do that to anybody. Please have it on the same day in a block of time, please.
Along those lines, when I would get kicked out of a room mid-sentence or something like that, because it always feels so freaking awkward because you're hoping that you're making this great connection and all of a sudden you're gone. You usually bounce back into a waiting room where all of them bounce back too before they go to their next interview. And so usually what I would do in that scenario is if I was like having a great interview, we were mid-sentence about something, I would then quickly send a personal chat message to the interviewer, just being like, sorry, we got cut off. Really enjoyed talking to you, something, or, you know, finish the sentence that you were saying, just so they like, you know, it's just, I don't know, a kind thing to do. I don't know. But you know, it's just some way to kind of bring some closure to the interview.
That's a great tip.
That being said, you may not always have that opportunity. I know for a few of mine, and it was very dependent on the specific interview, like the specific institution, because some institutions started with links. So they would send you links and you'd be like at 10 a.m. you have to click this link, and you had anywhere between 10 to 30 minutes was usually what mine ranged as. And then others had more of that like waiting room where then you got put into a breakout room where you either clicked in or somebody put you in there, usually the program coordinator or something. So it was those where I would often have that experience of the like being pulled mid-sentence back. But for, I don't know, most of mine that had that, there were no actual attendings in that waiting room. It was just other residents. So I didn't have the opportunity, like most of that was like the end. So I was mid-sentence and that was how it ended. So usually you use the like waiting room as your like detox and laughing with your other residents that are there having the same thing go on. So don't be alarmed if it happens.
Yeah, but obviously like we're all saying the same thing. It just happens. So if you get cut off mid-sentence, like they're not going to be like, oh, they didn't time their sentence right. Like, you know, it happens. This is the way that it is right now, and they're not going to say anything. But if you do have an opportunity to just kind of close the loop at the end in a waiting room, if they're in that waiting room with you, then I think that kind of shows that you're just, I don't know, a good person.
I found the interviews where I wasn't responsible for entering the room less stressful than the ones where I was placed into rooms, because then I felt like less of it was on me to make sure I typed in the Zoom link correctly. And I prefer to be in a waiting room to get pulled somewhere than to be expected to type in a brand new link into Zoom and get it right and be on time. Just from an interviewee standpoint, while you could get pulled back mid-sentence, it was overall less stressful experience because it was basically the equivalent of you being walked to the next room in person versus you having to just find it somewhere in a building.
Yeah, you were where you were supposed to be. Because I know there was one time where I had a link and I clicked on it at the time I was supposed to, and I always did it like 1 or 2 minutes before, and I don't know what happened on the other end, I forgot now, but I was sitting in an empty room for 10 minutes wondering if I did something wrong, and knowing that like I had the other one next. So I'm like calling and emailing the coordinator saying like, hi, I don't have anybody in this room, just checking. So obviously in situations like that, you don't have that sense of control that you do when you're just in a waiting room otherwise.
Yeah. And I think when some of those issues happen, whether you're in a waiting room or not, if you're in a waiting room, it's kind of nice because you have, usually the program coordinator is in there too, so you can message them, hey, what's going on? But I would always recommend having your cell phone near you, because there are some times where if it glitches with the video and they want to do it like, just call your cell phone. I had one interview where I truly just was on the phone with somebody because they couldn't figure out how to get it going, and so we ended up just having a phone call. So just kind of be ready to do whatever, just to, you know, get the interview, the most out of the interview process.
Dr. Srinivasan, I'm going to call on you as faculty here. Obviously, we're hearing that there's a lot of awkwardness or awkward moments that can happen, and just kind of wanting to get your reassurance that that doesn't in any way influence us. But, you know, obviously there's going to be a lot of like, did you hear me? Or, oh, you just cut out, that kind of stuff. Do you have any tips for how to kind of recover from that when you feel like you're in the flow and then you get cut out and you have to step back in?
I think that naturally happens a little bit. It's going to be nerve-wracking for the students no matter what, especially because this will probably, it's unlike a lot of medical student interviews when you've interviewed for medical school. And so even when you come and you do a physical interview, you may be set up with a faculty member and get a knock, and you may be having a great conversation and kind of get pulled away from that. And so I think the tips that everyone's given, you know, if you're having a great conversation, circling back and dropping a line to the faculty afterwards because all their emails are accessible is a nice thing to do. Don't let yourself get rattled. You have to kind of get practice at being able to shake it off and move from one room to another. For us, we're going to design our virtual interviews to be fairly identical to what they were like. So I will not be doing interviews, but individually meeting with each of the students for 15-minute intervals so that I make sure everyone we interview meets with me. And then we're going to have, you know, 3 interviewers per student. So it's not going to be quite like what fellowship interviews are like for y'all, because the difference will certainly be that most of the time when you guys do fellowship interviews, you're meeting the entire faculty. And that's not going to be the case for the medical students. So I hope that some of that, first of all, we won't be packing in as many transitions. And so I'm hoping that that'll be a little bit easier for people. And the interviews will hopefully be a little bit longer for them as well.
Great. A question that we've actually had people bring up and submit from a lot of medical students, and then I myself also worry about it as an applicant, as a resident, is talking about the night before event, or kind of the social event aspect. Can you guys tell us about a couple examples of how other programs did the night before and how that went, so we can kind of learn a little bit more about how they did the social aspect?
So I can comment on this one. So I think this was kind of the biggest loss for me for virtual interviews. So I had kind of, each program did a little bit different. The 2 main ways that they did it was either one, they did like a night before where you had a Zoom link sent for like a 5:30 to 6:30 happy hour with the fellows on and all the applicants. Sometimes that was a little hard, one, just because if you're in a clinical rotation, it's hard to kind of take 2 times off to get on both interviews. And 2, it's just kind of naturally a little bit more awkward to sit on a Zoom with people you don't know, happy houring and asking questions. So I felt like that was a little bit of a loss. The other way that they would do it would then either be during your interview day while you're in the waiting room, as we all kind of mentioned, the fellows would come kind of pop in and out, and you can ask them questions as the day went on. That was kind of nice because it was a little bit more casual. You can just kind of ask them questions as they kind of went in and out. And I feel like they didn't necessarily feel like they had to be on for the whole time. So they, you know, were more apt to just kind of pop in for 10 minutes, then go do something else and come back and back and forth. And then the third main way was when you were done with all of your interviews, at the end of the day, they would do like a formal hour-long, again, kind of virtual happy hour with the fellows. I think for me, in a lot of these, I kind of sat back and listened to what other people were asking. Just kind of, one, more so my personality, and 2, again, it was just, you never kind of knew when people were going to start talking. So to me, it was always, again, that little bit of awkwardness. But I would, you know, one thing that I did was I always had a piece of paper, similar to other folks, had a piece of paper with me with just kind of basic questions that I would try to get out of every program. Again, you kind of lose that in-person, seeing the city, seeing the school kind of feel. So I would have, you know, somewhat generic questions, but ones that could be applied to every program with me. And then if there was a moment of silence, I would try to chime in and ask something. But a little bit more of an awkward thing, and I think kind of the biggest thing that you unfortunately lose on virtual interviews. So.
Yeah, I don't think it's exactly what Caitlin said. It's not the fun, you know, low-key social event that you get in the real world and pre-COVID world. But I think what I did find it to be helpful for was that even though you're not gonna, you know, shoot the shit and have fun, you're still having an opportunity to ask some questions with the residents and fellows for our situation. But you still have an opportunity to ask about things, you know, everyday things like, where do most of the people live? What is the cost of living? What is your vacation schedule like? Things like that you want to make sure that you take interview day, but you're not going to be asking those type of questions to your attending interviewers. And so again, it doesn't, you definitely lose getting to watch the residents or the fellows interacting, get a sense of what the actual program is like, how well they get along, do they enjoy each other's company, that kind of thing. But you can still maximize that time and still use it as an opportunity to ask those questions that you may feel uncomfortable asking an attending or faculty about, but it's still very important for consideration when you're making your final decision about, do I want to move to that city? Would my significant other like that city? What are the daycare options? What are things like that has nothing to do with the program, but will very much impact your life for the next 5 to 7 years.
Did you guys feel like you had a good sense of actually getting to meet some of the current fellows, as well as, well, let's start with that one. Did you guys feel like you got a chance to meet or talk to your current fellows enough?
From the perspective of the fact that I did 5 in person and then a bunch virtual, you definitely lose a lot by doing it virtual. You don't get to see the interaction of the fellows, but in a not structured environment nearly to the extent that you would when you're sitting in a conference room having breakfast with them, waiting for the presentation to start the morning of. You don't get to see the interaction between rooms of just their day-to-day interactions with each other and between the fellows and the attendings. So you definitely lose some of that behind the scenes that you just can't get virtually.
But so on all of the interviews they had, Breast is a smaller fellowship in general, so a lot of programs will have 1, 2, the most is about 5 fellows. So, but they would have all of those fellows present for either the night before social hour thing, or there would be on the actual day of the interview, you would either have an interview with the fellows, or there would be a waiting room situation, or during lunch, they would have you have lunch with the fellows, something like that. So there was always, except for one program, I won't say it because I think there's a lot of different people from different programs here, but one program did not have any opportunity to talk with fellows. There was no social thing. There was no introduction. It was just 4 interviews with faculty, and it was horrible. But most other programs will have an opportunity where you actually do get a chance to socialize to some degree with the fellows. And I think all programs are making an effort to make that part of their experience, because they realize that we're really losing that in this virtual process. Get access to the cost.
I think you can actually get an idea of how the fellows interact with each other, even virtually. Like, I think I did 3 in-person interviews, and then the rest of mine turned virtual. You just kind of have to tune into different things. Are they making jokes with each other, even virtually, you won't get the same kind of body language interaction and in-person vibe, but I think you can still get some bit from just kind of watching how they speak to each other. If they seem to have jokes amongst them as they're talking, you can still get a vibe from them.
I think that I actually called every fellow for every program I wanted to go to totally separately, on a totally separate day, got their email or phone number or something through whatever avenue. And it was a totally different experience, because they would be so happy-go-lucky on a Zoom call with everybody there on happy hour, and then they interview you, and that's sort of a more formal thing, or they only have 10 minutes. And then you just get them in a more informal situation where they just want to talk to you as an applicant. And they're like, hey, what other programs are you applying to? What are you actually looking for? Here's what I actually don't like about the program. Things that they're maybe not going to say publicly in a group of interviewees or in an interview setting, that maybe you get a little sense of. But I think they just feel more comfortable over the phone, one-on-one, or just even via email being hey, honestly, here's how it is. So I highly, highly recommend doing that if you have the opportunity.
I was actually going to ask, there was a question on whether or not you felt like there was more pressure or a lot of pressure then, because of kind of the less interaction you get to follow up, to make connections outside of these Zooms and Zoom interviews, and to get to know the current fellows or attendings more so than you did in person.
One attending actually told me implied very strongly, almost like he expected me to come visit the program, which I thought was totally inappropriate considering it's a global pandemic, but then was like, I expect that you email us with further questions. Like it was implied, like if you don't follow up and say anything, then I'm just going to assume you're not interested in this program. So definitely do.
I'm going to chime in there just because there's certainly been on the program director thread a lot of concern that there may be programs individually reaching out to trainees and telling them you have to come to the city and meet up with us. And I know on the part of the students, there may really be some concern that you're going to be at a disadvantage if you don't do something like reach out, fly to a city and meet with the residents and the faculty. That's really discouraged. We made a commitment that we were going to, so, from a national standpoint, that's discouraged. So I just, commit to any of the medical students on here who may be interviewing with us that no one's going to be an advantage if they happen to, come to Atlanta. If they reach out to me, I'm not going to meet with them personally. I'm happy to answer questions over Zoom calls and through email, and I'll do that for everyone. But we really have to have a level playing field for everyone. And I don't want anyone to think that you're going to be at a disadvantage if you don't make a physical trip to a city that is still one of the 10 worst states in the country as far as COVID is concerned. Not that you shouldn't come here for residency, but we have to be responsible about how we think about this from a public health perspective. And I know a number of the program directors, this was gone through the threads the last couple of days, echoed that they're dismayed that there would be any suggestion. Although I'm a realist and I know that there must be, rest assured, they're not really supposed to be pressuring you or asking you to come meet with them physically, at least on the, residency front. Fellowship may be a little bit different, but this is certainly a commitment we made on the residency front.
Yeah, it was actually easier on the fellowship front, at least in breast oncology, because it was such a small crew of us that we were all on a WhatsApp thread. And when that started happening, when programs were asking applicants to come check out their program, come see them in person, we all kind of were talking about that, how it was unrealistic and silly in a pandemic and all this, and actually contacted the SSO, and then they sent out an email to all the program directors that they were not allowed to do that, which kind of shut it down.
Any other chiefs want to chime in on this, or do we want to move on to the next topic? Oh, Allie, are you talking, or are we? Okay. Another question that actually, Clara, you kind of just touched on too, that we had, was whether or not you felt like, I think one of my favorite parts of medical her residency interview was getting to know some of the other applicants, and I know that's one of the things I was most looking forward to for my endocrine surgery fellowships. Did you guys feel like you had enough of a chance to meet some of the other applicants that were with you guys? And I mean, did you guys still make kind of the same group of friends as everybody seems like they do on these interview trails?
No, definitely not. So that is 100% one of the downsides, one of the greatest downsides, I think, of the virtual interviewing. Kind of like Clara and the breast group, we had a WhatsApp chain too. So I did get to meet some people that way. And I met a few of them in person at the beginning before COVID hit. So it was kind of nice to have that continuity. So those were probably the people that I had kind of become friendly with from the 3 that I'd seen them at. I had that kind of prior to like keep it going, but for anybody that I didn't meet before or know from before, I didn't automatically become friends with them based on our like huge WhatsApp chain. It was still nice to have the WhatsApp chain because you could still all talk about, like, oh, this isn't working in this particular room, don't freak out, or oh, this particular interview is a little weird, FYI, be prepared. Like there were things that were kind of nice about it in general because you could just keep each other posted, or oh, there's like this glitch with this, FYI. But yeah, in terms of getting to know your colleagues and your future coworkers, virtual is not the way to go.
Yeah, I got lucky. Like I said, I had 3 in person before they switched. And so I met a lot of people that way. And so when I joined the WhatsApp thread, I knew who the majority of these people were. And so I only am friends with them and knew who they were because I had the the beginning of my process was pre-COVID, but I think otherwise it would have been really hard to be engaged or even care about what so-and-so says about so-and-so program.
For those of you that were able to do in-person versus not in-person interviews, did you feel like there was, a difference in your perception of the programs having done a little bit of both, or can you guys kind of compare and contrast the two experiences?
Okay, or Allie, you want to go? Okay, I'll go. So so here's the thing. I mean, yes, there's definitely a difference. So, for example, I went to New York for one of mine, and they not only gave you a tour of the program and the hospital and the clinic setting and the ORs, but they also took you around to where they would potentially have you live for the year and showed you what a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, and all of that would be like. And, obviously that's huge, and that's something that you can't get virtually. I will say, like I mentioned earlier, there was one program that I could tell really didn't put in the effort to make a virtual experience as good as it could be, and that really turned me off from the program. But I will say the way that I ranked my final list, my top few were all virtual interviews compared to the, a big name in New York. And so if the program, going into it, which programs you might be interested in, but if the program really puts the time and effort into making the virtual experiences as good as it can be, you actually do walk away from it with a pretty good, picture of what that program will be. I think it's really important, more so than ever, doing these virtually, to really be annoyingly almost obsessive about notes and really write down how you feel about the program and what they did during the interview, because you're not going to have that sort of visceral reaction to it like you would if you were actually there walking through the campus and whatnot. So just be really mindful of what's important for you. Like I almost would have like little sections on my paper of like vacation, clinical exposure, operative volume, things like that, and kind of have like topics that I knew I wanted to make sure that I had written down and took away, because even if it's not virtual, interviews start to run together. You don't really remember what stands out from one, and it's even harder if they're all just on Zoom. So definitely just be hyper vigilant when you're writing your notes, and really and keep your rank list active throughout. So I would do a virtual interview, and then I would move them up or move them down compared to the other ones that I had done recently, and that kind of thing, so that I wasn't at the end of all this process trying to remember, oh, I was on that Zoom call when they said this, and I was doing that Zoom, just kind of, you have to be a little bit more aggressive throughout the process. But again, there's obviously a difference between virtual and in person, but if a program works hard to make it a good experience, then you still will walk away knowing, for the most part, what you'll get out of that program.
I just have to second Clara again. I think we interview very similarly. I had a notebook where I did the same thing and separated things in a section that I then would fill in this whole Excel sheet with each of those categories. And one of the categories, and the one I look back at the most, was just like the vibe column. Like, what vibe did I get from this program? Did I like the people? Was it weird? Was it awkward? How did I feel like I was going to get along with them? And that was the most important one. But it was also really useful later when I had filled out all those columns, and then I realized, I was making my rank list after my interviews were done, and I realized there were some boxes that were empty. It gave me a good, very valid reason to reach out to these programs and ask those questions to kind of fill in those blanks, so that I had a complete picture of every program before I made my rank list.
Danny, though, or anybody, do you guys feel like you really did get a good sense of the vibe of programs with these interviews in this format? And were there any things that, really helped you guys pick up on the vibe, I guess? I know that's kind of a hard question to do.
Yeah. Oh, go Kaylin.
I think that even for being virtual, I think, again, as Clara was saying, if the program really puts effort in, I think you could still get a reasonable vibe for what the program's like. it was, I was going into it super nervous that I wasn't going to get a sense if the faculty really like each other, or how the kind of group works. But I think you can really get a sense of, even going from room to room, with like how the faculty talk about each other, or how they all talk about research projects that they're on, or some of them would mention, a call that they took with the fellows, or calls that they took together, and just you can get a sense of that relationship. And I think in terms of a vibe for a program, again, as Clara mentioned, a lot of the programs, I didn't do any in-person interviews, so kind of missed that part. But a lot of the programs, more so later in the interview season, I think once people realized that virtual interviews was unfortunately kind of here to stay, put together, similar to how we've done, kind of videos that walked you around the hospital and interviewed, some videos interviewed med students up to RT people in the ICU, to the fellows and the faculty. And I thought that was a really nice touch, just one, to give you a sense of what the hospital actually looks like. Not that you should necessarily pick a program based on what the hospital looks like, but it is just kind of nice to know like what you're getting into. And then some programs would even, add in like, this is, different neighborhoods of the city. They'd have the fellows kind of take videos from where they lived, or, hey, this is kind of the downtown area, just to give you a sense of, what a place is like. And I think, those programs, if they're putting in that effort, again, I think you can get a sense that they really want to, have you choose the right place for you. And then again, and I don't know if anyone else felt this way, for me with virtual interviews, whereas I think for residency, I would probably ask more of the residents in terms of like city life, personal life, those kind of questions. A lot of the faculty on my interviews actually volunteered that information to me, which I thought was a nice touch. It gave us something else to talk about. They were all very kind of forthcoming about what they liked about the city. They would ask me like what me and my husband like to do and when I'm not working, and they would always kind of offer different, like, oh, well, this city has a lot of great restaurants, and this city has a lot of great like outdoor parks if you guys like taking walks and stuff. So I felt like that was also a vibe that I didn't necessarily expect from the faculty side of things, but something that, definitely don't feel discouraged or worried about asking faculty about like what they like about the city, because again, you kind of only have a certain number of opportunities to talk about your life outside of residency or outside of fellowship. So I would offer to you guys just to ask questions like that of the faculty as well.
Yeah, totally agree. I actually found that to be if an interview was going well, but it was a little longer and we had already sort of discussed everything on my CV or about the program, I did find that one of my favorite questions, and seemingly, they responded well to it at the end, would be like, so what's your favorite thing to do in Atlanta? Or what, like, what do you do on an off day in Atlanta? Something like that, where there is an opportunity for them to talk about what they think about the best thing about their city is, or ask what you like to do and kind of give you suggestions of what you could do in that city. So yeah, it always went well, and it's kind of a nice way to wrap up the conversation.
Yeah, and just to kind of echo also what Caitlin said about the being able to get a vibe, I have a kind of controlled experiment for one of the vibes in one of the places that I went to. So I went to a place physically before COVID, and I thought that they happened to be a little on the scattered side in person in how they presented the program, and kind of felt a little bit weird. But we moved on, did all my virtuals, and then they had their next interview was a virtual one. And since I was part of the WhatsApp group, it actually turned out that their virtual thing, everybody was sending a bunch of texts in the group chat about how like ridiculous their virtual interview was, and how it was all over the place and connections were terrible and they kept dropping and they didn't have it organized. So interestingly, people had the same experience both virtually and in person. So I think that you absolutely, like, programs can figure out a way to present themselves in a way that's accurate both ways. So.
Awesome. I did also just want to encourage again, if anybody has any questions they want to submit, I know I'm just going through my list of our predetermined questions, but people, please do feel free, speak up or type in the chat box. Why don't we move on while we see, Dora, have you gotten any questions from anybody yet?
Nope, nothing.
Okay. Why don't we hear, while we wait for people to buck up some courage, why don't we hear from you guys? Let's have all of you go around and tell us about one, I know you guys have already dropped a lot of meaningful knowledge and advice, but if there's kind of one thing you wish you could have done better, or one piece of advice you would give to applicants that are about to virtually interview. Can you guys fill us in on that?
Nobody can see what you're wearing from midway.
I was totally gonna say that too.
You have no idea if I have on scrubs or shorts.
Yeah, I never, ever, ever, ever wore a skirt or formal pants ever. I always was in either workout pants, shorts, something, and it was glorious.
One fellowship director threatened to make us all stand up, but he didn't.
Just make sure though that remember that Zoom allows you to automatically default when you log in to having your video and audio off. So I would suggest everyone do that and put a sticker over their camera until they know they're really ready to be seen. Because there are all these stories that go out about people being Zoomed with unintentional things on the screen. And so you definitely want to make sure that you don't have to worry about anything like that. Just a little tip that I've heard from people.
I think my biggest piece of advice, or one thing that I wished I knew before, like my first couple, was I think I read a lot of stuff about interviewing online where you're supposed to not act like more, I don't want to say professional because that's not the right word that I'm looking for, but act more refined, or it's on Zoom. I would encourage you all just to act as if you were having a conversation in person. It's a little weird the first couple of times, again, because you're on a computer, maybe the connection's not great, you can't hear what they said, but like don't be afraid to obviously I talk with my hands a lot. Like I talked on all of my interviews with the exact same kind of body language that I'm doing now. So don't be afraid to, again, act like you're sitting in front of the person. It makes you feel less awkward and less stressed about it if you're just yourself. And I think it gives the interviewer more of a sense of who you are as a person. So don't kind of tone down any, of your personality or anything that you would do in person. So that's kind of the one thing that I wish I didn't necessarily, I wish I knew going into it, but that didn't change midway. And it was much more comfortable.
Yeah, totally agree. Dr. Srinivasan, what are your thoughts on thank you notes?
It's always a good question. I mean, that's one of those things that you're kind of either raised to do or not. I'll tell you, we get a lot of thank you notes, and it does not, once again, just in terms of the ethics of it, we never want to have, I think it's a little bit different. So let me start off by saying there's a difference between getting thank you notes when you're a medical student interviewing for residency, and it's a much bigger pool. We interview 100 people. And when you're interviewing for a fellowship, where it's a couple of fellows, it's one or two spots amongst a group of fellows. So I think on the fellowship front, it makes a lot of sense because there's more expectation that you're going to have a lot of direct communication with the fellowship director as you're trying to pick your program. I think for medical students interviewing for residency programs, while it's a nice touch, and that may just be a thing you want to do because your parents taught you to do it, I don't know that it makes much of a difference. A thank you note by email to me is equivalent as a card. And I don't prioritize one person versus another, or assume that their interest is more than anyone else just because I got a thank you card. I think LA has a question if one of y'all wants to field that.
Yeah, we have a question from the audience. It says, did anyone have any weird or awkward experiences regarding kids, spouses, family life? And also, did you feel comfortable asking family-related questions?
So I did not have any awkward experiences, and I went out of my way to always ask about family related things, house related things, financial related things, really everything. And I think, we're all adults. We all are hardworking humans that are, we've chosen medicine to be our worlds, but we also have other things going on outside of that. And so I think if you ever do experience an awkward scenario around that, then that would be a red flag. I think most people are very open to telling you anything that you want to know about how to raise a kid in that city, how to get a house in that city, where to live in that city, what your spouse, if your spouse is in so-and-so, would they be able to find a job? Like these are very normal questions to be asking, and honestly, important questions to be asking. So if anybody ever had an awkward scenario with that, then I think that would just, in the grand scheme of things, the takeaway from that would be that that's a red flag.
As far as like pets running into videos or babies, I know Clara, baby's crying, or I know Caitlin, you mentioned you can hear your husband on your thing. How did you guys handle that? Did you acknowledge it and joke about it? Did you just ignore it and keep going?
So the one time it happened to me and you could hear my husband on his own Zoom call, I just made a joke. I was like, oh, well, you can both see that we're working from home today. And the interviewer totally understood, laughed it off. It was not a big deal. And then the one time it happened at the hospital, I think I made another joke about the code. Again, I think you have to go into this situation, since this is technically the first year that we're doing this. Who knows how long it's going to last, if it's going to be the new norm, or if in a couple of years, hopefully, knock on wood, we can go back to normal. I think you just have to, again, have a little bit of fun with it. Bad connections happen, sounds happen, pets run in if you're at home. And I think, again, I always just acknowledged it and made a joke, and no one seemed to be like, oh my gosh, you're at home with your husband. Like, that's terrible. Like, how dare you interrupt our interview? I mean, just acknowledge it and move on. Not a big deal.
Yeah.
There are a couple of questions about tech savviness that I think you all may want to address, but I'm going to throw a question out to you guys. In terms of internet strength, did you just choose specifically to do everything in the hospital because you knew you were going to have continued internet access, or have any of you purchased these mesh devices that boost the strength of your personal internet access? Would you recommend that for the students?
If you have questionable internet, then yes, you have to find someplace that has good internet. We are lucky enough to have high-speed internet in our building, so we've not had a problem. We tested it beforehand, across different parts of the house, just to figure out what was the best part. And we're not far away from our wireless router, so we knew that we had the bandwidth in order to do it.
And I think it's easier to do it at home if you do have good internet at home, just because you know your environment a little bit better. There's less unknowns where someone comes in and says, hey, can you go do this? Or there's a dressing change here, or there's a code happening. You get pulled into too many clinical things if you're physically in the hospital, I think, or you could. And then also you can take snack breaks, which is super clutch when you're at home.
As far as the tech questions, you can't. The tendency is always to look people in the eye, and it's very weird. But right now, I'm having to stare at the green dot on the top of my computer. The inclination is for me to look down at somebody's face when I'm talking to them, and you don't notice this, but after you have a couple of Zoom interviews, you start to notice that the people on the news on TV, you can tell they're staring directly into a camera that they're not seeing the face on the screen below them. So you have to train yourself to look not at the eyes of somebody who's on the screen below you, but to actually look right into the camera so that it looks like you are looking, because looking in the camera is looking them in the eye is how you have to think about it.
Just a plug for that, Matt. I noticed that you were doing that. I was like, he's doing it because Dr. Chen told me to do that. She was like, I noticed like it's really annoying when people look at the faces and they're not looking. It doesn't look like they're making eye contact.
But I don't know. It happens. I'm not great at it. I've tried,
No.
and I always default. And I think enough people default to doing it wrong that nobody's going to be like, ooh, X that girl. She looked, slightly off than like at the green light. So don't forget.
I've never done that.
The problem is that if everybody is looking at the camera, nobody can tell if you're actually looking them in the eye. If everybody's staring at their camera, then I have no idea if Dr. Srinivasan is actually looking me in the eye and down in the corner, because I'm not looking at her face.
Yeah, I never looked at the green dot. I am terrible at this, but if somebody notices that, it does, now that I'm watching Matt speak, when he speaks into the green dot, it does look great. But I think those details are like, no one's gonna fault you for being awkward in terms of like your eye contact, as they would when you're actually in person. So don't stress too much about that. But if you can start, practicing, maybe do some FaceTimes or Zoom calls with friends or family beforehand, I think that, it's worth it to try to kind of get yourself trained to do that.
Yeah, if you're going to be more weird doing it with like focusing on the green dot, don't do that. Just do what makes you comfortable. Like if it's going to take too much of your focus away, just focus on trying to present yourself as best as you can in the interview than those little specifics.
We also had a question about audio setup, as far as whether you guys used earbuds or if you used the computer mic.
Do
I
whatever.
use AirPod Pros. I love them. I don't know if you have tried it both ways. I mean, I guess you guys can do the experiment right now, listen to me talk versus listening to everybody else talk, see if you guys hear a difference. I don't know. I've been told from people interviewing that they do hear a difference, and then it kind of cuts out any background noise. This has some sound canceling mode on it, so if there's background noise around me, I have an easier time focusing. For me, I didn't have to like lean into my computer to hear things because my speakers weren't great or something, like somebody made a noise. I mean, I 100% recommend. You're not spending money traveling. These are like $200 or something. It's like still way less money than you're about to spend on planes. So I think they're worth it.
And then we did have a tip from LA that her husband works in broadcast TV, and so she asked tech coworkers. They recommended an Ethernet connection that is ideal for connectivity. And you guys can kind of read the rest of her thing, but it sounds like she's also pro AirPods. I think we're running close to the end of time. I did want to ask one final kind of just funny question to lighten up the mood. Did you guys see anything other people did on these interviews virtually that were just cringeworthy or things you would advise us to avoid?
There was one thing that always stood out to me. There was this one girl who I had met her in real life and I loved her and I thought she was great. But her like default picture when she would hide her video was a picture of her and her husband and all of her cats, and like I just found that to be so cringeworthy and so weird. So just keep your background picture professional, which like so far I've seen for the most part, yeah, everybody's on this is great. Like just keep it, don't stand out in the wrong way.
I think just choose your background of your interview room wisely. I had a couple people like zoom in from their bedroom with a very messy bed and clothes, and it just looked in disarray, and I was very uncomfortable. There was like a bathroom door open in the back, and I guess it's okay, who knows, but just make sure just test everything out. Sit at the computer, play with the angles, play with the lighting, just make sure that you feel comfortable. And again, no messy beds or messy rooms or bathrooms open in the background. I thought it was a little weird.
If you do have a messy background, you can always use the virtual backgrounds. They're not ideal because they're a little like glitchy when you move, but I had one for a while because I didn't know where I was going to be at any given time. I can show you guys if I can figure it out right now, but if you move, they do this like weird thing, so you do have to stay like really still. But it was kind of like a point of conversation also. I would just kind of be like, it was like something like this. It was just like a white wall, but look, if I move, it like looks stupid, so I don't necessarily recommend doing that, but if your like alternative is like something very strange, you could just put up like a white background if you wanted.
And I think just in general, not anything along that line, but if we are running out of time, something I just thought of, just same with in-person interviews. The big thing that everyone kind of walks away from these experiences saying is that like you want to have a list of questions ready for everybody that you're going to be interviewing with, because whether you're in person or you're virtual, there's going to be those moments where people are like, any other questions? Do you have any questions? Any questions? Any questions? And you just want to have some questions ready, or it's awkward in person, but it can be really awkward on virtual interviews if you just are awkwardly looking at each other. So always have some sort of standard questions that are your go-to if there's a lull in the conversation, or if at the end they say, and what questions do you have? You always have something ready. And obviously make sure that they are meaningful questions, that whatever you're asking will impact your ultimate decision. But definitely have a list of questions ready for every interview.
We also did have one last quick question in the box regarding how you prepared for behavior questions. I think that might be maybe referring to, actually I'm not sure. Ting, if you want to unmute and kind of clarify.
Hello, yeah. So for example, the program director asked about in a certain clinical scenario, what should you do, like that?
It's so, I mean, in my experience, at least, it's not so much that, and Dr. Srinivasan can correct me if she knows more about sort of the mentality of program directors these days, but it's not often a clinical scenario, and they're asking you what to do. I think in some fellowship interviews they will, but I think for medical students, a lot of it will be, tell me about a clinical scenario that you were involved in and your thought process on the workup and management, or tell me about an experience that you felt uncomfortable with, or tell me about an experience that you were proud of and what was your involvement, something like that. So it's more of that you're going to be the one offering up the clinical scenario. And so that is another thing that I would say, just have a few tough situations, tough like decision making, or involving like palliative because the patient was end stage something. There's a lot of, you know, things that they can pull from that, of like how you handled a difficult situation, or how you handled a sad scenario or a complex medical workup, those kind of things. So it's usually that you are the one that will actually have to present a scenario, but they'll be asking you about your experience with that, as opposed to them pimping you about something. But I could be wrong on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, you know, you'll probably hear a little bit of that depending on your interviewer. Remember that all of the programs have a standard set of interviewers, and they all have different personalities. Before I was program director and I was doing a lot of the interviews, I would ask students about their favorite joke, because I think you have to have a sense of humor in surgery. So there may be things that people end up asking you that give them a sense about who you are. And particularly in this era where we're not really capable of doing, you know, as many sub-Is, so people can't externally rotate and come down here for us to get a sense about what they're like. You may get some questions that, you know, get a sense about what your temperament is like. I don't know that there's really any preparing for that. You know, the reality is you want to be honest in your answer to those things, because you want to fit in the program. So, you know, if they don't like your answers and they don't think that you're going to be a good values fit for the program, it may not be a place that you're going to be happy. You really just want to go with your instincts when it comes to that sort of stuff. I think the more natural that people are at answering those kinds of questions, the better. That's kind of my personal opinion about it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Srinivasan.
Great. Well, do any of the chiefs have any final words of wisdom they'd like to share? Sounds like you guys have already given us a ton of really helpful information, so I really appreciate everybody's time. And thank you everyone for joining us for this event. I think we can safely wrap up. I think I've personally learned a lot, and I'm excited and more prepared for my own fellowship interviews. So thank you guys so much for your time, to our panelists, and thank you to everybody for joining. Again, don't forget to check us out on wiserpodcast.com or through our podcast. We did record this, so we are going to also find a way to distribute this either through a podcast kind of digital episode or posting this video somewhere. So feel free to share with your friends if you found this was meaningful, and look for our link to this when it is available. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Great job, panelists. Thanks for being here for everyone.
Yes. Thank you so much, our panelists. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Clara.
Thanks, Jess. This was awesome.
Thank you. Thanks for joining. All right. Thanks for your help, Dora. Thanks for being on.
Bye, Jess.
Bye. I'm going to end the meeting.
Okay, bye.